Hey friends, welcome back. And as usual, today we have a couple scary stories for you. But before we begin, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe because that's really important to me to make this channel grow. I also want to know where do you come from and what time are you watching these videos. So without further ado, I don't want to wasting your time. Dim the light, pull up your blanket, or do whatever you do to relax. And as always, I hope you all have a great night. Let's begin.
I moved to Denver in February, which in hindsight was a mistake for reasons that have nothing to do with the weather. I'd taken a job at a mid-sized marketing firm, the kind of place that promises growth opportunities and delivers mostly stress, and I didn't know a single person in the entire state. My best friend Priya was back in Chicago, my family was in Ohio, and my apartment. A one-bedroom on the third floor of a building with a broken elevator. Felt less like a home and more like a place I was storing myself between shifts. By April, I'd had exactly one conversation that wasn't work-related, and it was with the guy at the coffee shop who told me my card had been declined. So when my coworker Jess suggested I try one of the dating apps, I laughed at first, then went home that night and downloaded it anyway. I told myself it was just for something to do, a distraction. Maybe I'd meet someone for coffee. Maybe I wouldn't. But at least I'd have somebody to text besides my mom. I made a profile that felt embarrassingly earnest. A few pictures from a friend's wedding, one of me hiking somewhere in Ohio 2 years earlier, a bio that mentioned I liked true crime podcasts and bad reality TV, and that I was new to Denver, send restaurant recs. I set my preferences, closed the app, and didn't think about it again until the next morning when I had 43 notifications. 43. I sat on the edge of my bed in my work clothes, scrolling through a wall of faces, and felt a specific kind of overwhelmed that I think only exists in the first week of using one of these apps. Most of them I swiped past without much thought. A few I matched with and never spoke to. But one message stopped me before I even swiped. It wasn't a match request. It was already sitting in my inbox, which the app apparently allowed for a certain subscription tier, and it read, "I don't usually do this, but your hiking picture looks like it was taken at Hocking Hills. I grew up 40 minutes from there. Small world if I'm right." I stared at that message for a long time. It was such a small, specific thing to notice. Hocking Hills isn't exactly famous outside of Ohio, and the photo didn't have a location tag or a caption. I clicked on his profile. His name was Daniel. 31, 6'1" according to the app. An outdoor photo where he was standing in front of a lake somewhere with mountains behind him, another of him in a flannel shirt laughing at something off camera, one of him with a dog that wasn't identified as his but that I assumed was. His bio said he worked in software, had moved to Denver a few years back for the mountains, stayed for the mountains, and that he was looking for someone to go on hikes with who wouldn't complain the whole way up. I wrote back. I don't even remember exactly what I said. Something about yes, that was Hocking Hills. My parents used to take me there as a kid. Small world indeed. He responded almost instantly, and for the next 2 hours we went back and forth about hiking trails and Midwestern childhoods and how neither of us understood how anyone survived a Colorado winter without four-wheel drive. It felt easy. That's the word I kept coming back to when I described it to Priya later. It felt easy, like talking to someone I already knew. He was funny without trying too hard to be funny. He asked questions and actually seemed to care about the answers, which after a week of matching with men whose entire personality was a gym selfie and the word vibes, felt like drinking water after being thirsty for longer than I'd realized. We talked every day for the next week and a half. Not obsessively. He wasn't one of those guys who texted good morning and good night like a script, but consistently, easily. The kind of conversation that filled the dead 15 minutes on the bus or the boring stretch of a Tuesday evening. He worked long hours, he said, which was why he preferred texting to calling most nights, but he always circled back around eventually. At some point in that first week, I mentioned offhand that I'd been having trouble sleeping since the move, that my new apartment had a weird creak in the floor by the window that I couldn't place, and that it kept waking me up around 2 or 3 in the morning. He said that happened to him too when he moved into his place. That old buildings settle, and it's usually nothing. And then he sent me a video of a cat doing something ridiculous, and the conversation moved on. I didn't think about it again until much later, when it became one of several small details I couldn't stop turning over in my head. We set up a first date for a Thursday, 2.5 weeks after we'd started talking. He suggested a wine bar downtown, said he knew the bartender, that it was quiet enough to actually talk. I remember standing in front of my closet for 45 minutes trying to find something that looked like I'd put in effort without looking like I'd put in effort. And I remember texting Priya a photo of 2 outfit options. And I remember being nervous in a way I hadn't been nervous about anything in months. He was already there when I arrived, seated at a small table near the window, and he stood up when he saw me, which felt old-fashioned in a way I appreciated. In person, he looked like his pictures, which, after 2 friends had told me horror stories about catfishing, felt like a small relief in itself. He was warm, easy to talk to, quick to laugh at my jokes, and quicker to make me laugh at his. We talked for 3 hours. We talked about our families, our exes in the vague, careful way you do on a first date, our jobs, the things we missed about the Midwest and the things we didn't. There was only one moment that night that snagged in my memory afterward, a small burr I didn't notice until I ran my hand back over it days later. At one point, I was telling him about my apartment, complaining lightly about the broken elevator, and he said, "3rd floor, right? At least you've got the good light in the mornings." I hadn't told him what floor I lived on. I'm almost positive I hadn't. But in the moment, sitting across from him with a glass of wine and his easy smile, I brushed right past it, assumed I must have mentioned it and forgotten, the way you do 100 small things in 100 small conversations. The date ended with him walking me to my car, a hug that lingered just slightly longer than a first date hug usually does, and a text 20 minutes later that just said, "I had a really good time tonight." I remember smiling at my phone in my parked car like an idiot. For the next 2 weeks, things moved the way things move when they're going well. A second date, a movie and dinner. A third, a hike he'd promised me, up in the foothills, where he packed sandwiches and pointed out the names of mountains I'd never heard of, and made me laugh so hard at the top that I nearly lost my footing on the way down. He was attentive without being suffocating, funny without being a smartass, and he asked about my day in a way that made it clear he actually remembered what I'd told him the day before. Jess said I was glowing. My mom asked when she'd get to meet him, half joking, the way moms do 3 dates in. It was around the 4th week that the small things started. The first one I almost didn't register as a thing at all. I was at work, scrolling through my phone during lunch, and I liked a photo on Instagram of a coffee shop 2 blocks from my apartment. Just a nice photo of a latte, nothing tagged with location beyond the shop's own name in the caption. That evening, Daniel texted me, "Hey, was that you at Blue Sparrow earlier? Thought I saw you through the window walking by around lunch." I told him no, I'd been at work all day. Must have been someone who looked like me. He said, "Huh, weird, could have sworn," and dropped it, and so did I. Coincidences happen. People see people who look alike all the time. The second one happened about a week after that. We'd been texting about weekend plans, and I mentioned I was thinking about repainting my bedroom, that I'd bought a sample of a sage green color and was deciding if I liked it on the wall. 2 days later, when I opened my apartment door after work, there was a small paper bag hanging from the doorknob. Inside was a single votive candle, unscented, cream-colored, no note. I texted him, half joking, asking if he'd left me a gift, and he said no. Wasn't him, maybe a neighbor, and I laughed it off and put the candle on my dresser and didn't think much more about it, because what else was I supposed to think? It was a candle. People do nice, mysterious things sometimes. Not everything has to mean something. Except once I'd noticed the pattern. I couldn't stop noticing it. There was the time he asked, out of nowhere, if the creak in my floor by the window had gotten better, 3 weeks after I'd mentioned it exactly once and never again. There was the time I wore a shirt I'd bought online but hadn't worn yet, hadn't posted anywhere, hadn't mentioned to anyone, and he complimented the color as if he'd seen it, then backtracked and said I must have described it to him at some point, which I hadn't. There was the time I got home late from a work event and found my bedroom window, which I always locked, a habit drilled into me by a mother who watched too much local news. Unlocked, the latch simply flipped, no sign of forced entry, nothing missing, nothing disturbed. I told myself I'd forgotten to lock it. I told myself that so many times that I almost believed it. There was one more incident before Priya's visit that I've had to work hard to place correctly in my memory, because for a long time I told it to myself as something else entirely. I was walking home from the light rail one evening in late May, maybe a 10-minute walk from the station to my building, a route I'd done 100 times by then without thinking twice about it. About halfway there, I had the distinct, prickling sense that someone was behind me. Not close. I never saw a face, never heard footsteps I could clearly separate from the general noise of the street. Just a feeling, low and persistent, the kind you usually talk yourself out of within a block or two. I didn't talk myself out of it that night. I sped up. I crossed the street unnecessarily, then crossed back, the way I'd read you're supposed to do if you think someone's following you, just to see if they mirrored the move. When I glanced back at the corner behind me, there was a man in a dark jacket standing near a bus stop, not obviously looking at me, doing nothing you could point to as suspicious, and I felt so silly for even noticing him that I almost laughed at myself right there on the sidewalk. I got home, locked my door, and told myself it was nothing. A stranger waiting for a bus, nothing more, and that I was letting the general anxiety of being new in a big city turn ordinary strangers into threats. I mentioned it to Daniel that night, actually, half as a joke, saying something like, "I think city living is making me paranoid. I got spooked by a guy at a bus stop." He responded quickly, reassuringly, told me that feeling was normal, that Denver had gotten less safe in some neighborhoods over the past few years, that I should always trust my gut, and he was glad I made it home okay. It was, in the moment, exactly the kind of response I wanted from someone I was falling for. Protective, warm, taking my fear seriously instead of dismissing it. It wasn't until much later, lying awake in that hotel room with my phone turned face down on the nightstand, that I let myself really sit with how strange it was that he'd never once asked me what the man in the dark jacket had looked like. I didn't say anything to Daniel about most of this. Part of me was embarrassed, worried I'd sound paranoid or crazy over what were, individually, such small things. Part of me. And this is the part I'm less proud of. Didn't want to ruin what was, in every other respect, the best relationship I'd had in years. He made me laugh. He remembered my coffee order. He held my hand in a way that made the rest of the world feel very far away. I didn't want to be the girl who blew up a good thing because of a candle and a coincidence and a window I probably just forgot to lock. It was Priya who finally made me say it out loud. She'd flown out for a long weekend in June, the first time we'd seen each other since I'd moved, and on the second night, after 2 bottles of wine on my couch, I told her about the little things. The floor creak, the shirt, the window. I expected her to laugh at me, to tell me I was overthinking, and for the first half of the conversation, that's exactly what she did. But then I mentioned the 3rd floor thing, the fact that he'd known I lived on the 3rd floor before I'd told him, and I watched her face change. "You never told him that?" she said. "I don't think so. I've gone back over it in my head so many times. I really don't think I did." She was quiet for a second, and then she said the thing that changed everything, the thing I hadn't let myself think. Not really, not out loud. "Have you ever actually seen where he lives? Met any of his friends? Talked to anybody who knows him outside of, texting?" I hadn't. 3 months in, and I realized, sitting there on my own couch with my best friend staring at me like I'd just told her I'd been sleepwalking through traffic, that I had never once been to his apartment. He always came to mine, or we met at restaurants, or we met at trailheads. Every excuse had sounded reasonable in the moment. His place was a mess. His roommate was weird about guests. It was closer to just meet halfway. I had met exactly 0 of his friends, 0 of his coworkers, 0 of his family. I knew where he said he worked, but I had never actually confirmed it. I knew his last name, or thought I did, but when Priya asked me to spell it, I realized I'd only ever seen it typed in a chat bubble in a slightly stylized font, and I genuinely wasn't sure if the second letter was an E or a C. That night, after Priya went to sleep on my pull-out couch, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and did something I probably should have done back in April. I reverse image searched his photos. The lake photo came back first, attached to a completely different name, a completely different city, a stock photography and modeling portfolio site based in Sacramento. The man in the photo was a model, apparently someone who did outdoor and lifestyle shoots for clients who needed a generic, attractive, outdoorsy man. His actual name, I'll call him Alex, though that wasn't it, had nothing to do with Daniel. I sat there staring at the screen with my stomach slowly turning over. I searched the flannel shirt photo next. Same site. Same man. Same story. The dog photo took longer to find, buried 3 pages into results, but it turned up too. A post from a rescue shelter in Arizona, a photo used to advertise an adoptable golden retriever mix 2 years earlier. The man's face wasn't even fully visible in that one, just an arm and a shoulder, but the shirt matched, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Every single photo on Daniel's profile belonged to somebody else. There was no Daniel. There had never been a Daniel. There was only whoever had been sitting across from me at that wine bar 3 months ago, whoever had held my hand on that hike, whoever had known, somehow, that I lived on the 3rd floor before I had ever told him. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at that table until the sky started going gray outside my window, going back through every single conversation, every single date, every single small, strange detail I talked myself out of, and building them into a shape I didn't want to look directly at. I woke Priya up around 6 and told her everything I'd found. She didn't say, "I told you so," which I've always loved her for. She just got very quiet, very focused, and said, "Okay, we're not doing anything stupid. We're going to figure out who this actually is, and then we're going to the police. And until then, you're staying somewhere else." I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters for the rest of this story. My first instinct was not fear. It was something closer to disbelief. A kind of vertigo, like the floor of my life had quietly been replaced with something else while I wasn't looking, and I was only now noticing the difference in how it felt under my feet. The fear came later. The fear came in pieces, and once it started arriving, it didn't stop. Priya and I spent that entire day going back through every text, every call, every detail he'd ever mentioned about himself, trying to find something, anything that could actually be traced. It was strange, doing that. 3 months of daily conversation, and almost none of it, when you actually laid it out, was verifiable. He'd said he worked in software but never named the company. He'd said he had a sister in Portland but never mentioned her last name. He'd said he grew up near Hocking Hills but never named the town. Every specific detail dissolved the moment you tried to hold on to it, and I realized, with a sick, sinking feeling, that whoever this was had been extremely careful. This wasn't sloppy. This wasn't some guy who'd grabbed a few photos off the internet on a whim. This was constructed. The phone number was a burner. One of those app-based numbers that route through the internet rather than an actual carrier. Easy to get, easy to abandon. I called it that afternoon, my hands actually shaking, and it rang twice and went to a generic voicemail greeting, a robotic voice reciting the number back to me. No name. Nothing. I did file a police report 2 days later, once Priya had physically walked me to the station because I kept finding reasons to put it off. The officer who took my statement was polite, but I could tell not particularly alarmed. Catfishing wasn't a crime, he explained gently. Using someone else's photos wasn't a crime. If there was no threat, no theft, no assault, there wasn't much they could actively do beyond taking my report and telling me to block the number, which I'd already done, and to be careful. What about my window? I asked. What about him knowing things he shouldn't have known? The officer looked at his notes, then back at me, and said the thing I'd already half known he was going to say. Do you have proof he was the one who unlocked that window? Or that he was the one who left the candle? I didn't. I had a feeling, a stack of small, unprovable coincidences, and a stomach that hadn't fully settled in 3 days. That was not, apparently, enough. I stayed at Priya's Airbnb for the rest of her visit, and when she flew back to Chicago that Sunday, I didn't go back to my apartment. I told myself it was temporary, that I was being cautious, that I just needed a few days to get my head straight, and I checked into a hotel near my office under a name that was technically mine but that I'd never used for anything, my middle name instead of my first, paid in cash for the first night because some instinct I didn't fully understand told me to. The messages started 2 days after that. Not from Daniel's old number. That one stayed dead silent, exactly as I expected. These came from a new number, a different area code, and the first one arrived at 11:47 p.m. while I was lying in that hotel bed trying and failing to fall asleep. It said, simply, "You didn't have to run." I stared at that message for what felt like a very long time. My hands went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the hotel's aggressive air conditioning. I didn't respond. I turned my phone face down on the nightstand and lay there in the dark, listening to every sound the building made, and there were a lot of them, and none of them were anything, and all of them felt like something. The second message came the next morning. The hotel breakfast isn't as good as they make it look in the pictures. You should have stayed home. I checked out within the hour. I don't fully know how he knew where I was. I hadn't posted anything, hadn't told anyone besides Priya and, in passing, Jess at work. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I'd already started to understand that this wasn't a person who needed me to tell him things. This was a person who found things out. I went to Jess's apartment that afternoon, badly shaken, and told her everything from the beginning. And she was kind about it in the exact right way, which was to not ask 100 questions and to just say, "Okay, you're staying here," and to make up her guest room without another word about it. I filed an updated police report about the messages, and this time the tone was slightly different, slightly more concerned, though the practical advice was largely the same. Document everything. Change my number if I could. Be careful about what I posted. Consider a restraining order once I had a name to attach it to, which I still didn't. For about a week, nothing happened. No messages, no candles, no unlocked windows, though I never went back to my old apartment to check. Not once, not even to grab more clothes. Jess did that for me, moving quickly through my apartment with her phone's flashlight on even in daylight, grabbing what I asked for and leaving fast. I started to let myself believe, cautiously, that maybe it had been a scare tactic, a last gasp of control from someone who now realized I was onto him, and that it might actually be over. It was Jess who found the note. She'd gone back to my apartment on a Tuesday to grab a few more things. A specific pair of boots, my passport, the box where I kept old photos. And she called me from the hallway outside my door, her voice tight in a way I'd never heard from her before. "Your door's unlocked," she said. "I know you said you locked it. It's unlocked right now." I told her not to go in. She went in anyway, because Jess has never once in her life done the smart thing when the stupid thing was more useful. And she stayed on the phone with me the entire time, narrating in a low voice like she was afraid the walls themselves might be listening. Nothing seemed to have been taken. The apartment looked, she said, essentially the same as when I'd left it, minus 3 weeks of dust and a stack of mail piled under the door slot. But on my kitchen table, where I used to sit and eat cereal in the mornings, there was a folded piece of paper that hadn't been there before. She read it to me over the phone, her voice shaking slightly by the end. It wasn't long, it said. "I know this looks bad. I promise I can explain everything if you just give me the chance. I've never felt this way about anyone. Please don't make me disappear again." Disappear again. Those 2 words sat in my chest for days afterward, heavier than anything else in the note, heavier than the fact that he'd been inside my apartment, heavier than the fact that Jess had been standing 5 feet from wherever he might still have been. Disappear again meant this wasn't the first time. It meant there was a pattern, a history, some other person somewhere who'd once sat across a table from this same charm, this same easy laugh, this same uncanny ability to know things he shouldn't know, and who had also, eventually, tried to disappear from it. That was the detail that finally moved the police from cautious concern to something closer to urgency. Breaking and entering, even without theft, was something they could actually act on. A detective was assigned to my case, a woman named Officer Ruiz, sharp and no nonsense in a way that made me feel, for the first time in weeks, like someone was actually on my side. She had the note tested for prints, though whoever this was had clearly been careful. Nothing came back. She pulled the burner number's activation records, which led to a dead end at a prepaid card purchased with cash at a gas station. The security footage from that gas station conveniently sitting just outside the range the store kept before automatically deleting it. But Ruiz did find one thing, working backward through the photos on the fake profile, the ones I'd already traced to that Sacramento modeling site. She found that the account, Daniel's account, had been created using an email address that had, at some point years earlier, been briefly associated with a different dating app, one that had suffered a data breach. In the leaked records from that breach, that same email was linked to a name. I won't say the real name here, because it's not really mine to say, and because by the time I learned it, it didn't feel like it belonged to a person so much as to the shape of a threat, an outline with no fully colored in picture behind it. What I will say is that when Ruiz ran that name, it came back attached to an address across town, and it came back attached, somewhere in old records, to a restraining order filed 4 years earlier by a different woman in a different city. A case that had been quietly closed after the woman moved and stopped pursuing it. The kind of thing that happens more often than any of us want to think about. Ruiz told me this on a Thursday afternoon, sitting across from me at her desk, and I remember feeling a strange mix of relief and a fresh, colder kind of fear at the same time. Relief that this was real now, documented, that I hadn't imagined any of it, and fear because a name and an address meant a face, meant a real, physical person who had been inside my apartment and had known which floor I lived on before I ever told him, and who had, apparently, done this before. They went to the address 2 days later. He wasn't there. The apartment had been recently vacated. Not abandoned in a hurry, Ruiz said, but cleared out methodically, the way you'd expect from someone who'd had practice doing exactly this. The landlord said the tenant had paid his final month in cash and left no forwarding information. A neighbor described him as quiet, polite, kept to himself, and this detail made my skin crawl in a way I still haven't fully recovered from. Mentioned that he used to talk sometimes about a girlfriend who traveled a lot for work, someone the neighbor had never actually seen. I moved that month. Not just apartments. I moved across the city into a building with a doorman and cameras in the hallway and a lease under a slightly different version of my name, the middle name again, the one that felt like it belonged to someone who hadn't lived through any of this. I changed my number. I locked down every social account I had, made everything private, stopped posting photos with anything identifiable in the background. I deleted the dating app the same day Ruiz told me about the restraining order in that other city, and I haven't downloaded another one since. Not once. Not even on the nights when the loneliness of a new city creeps back in exactly the way it did that February. There was one final piece to the investigation that Ruiz shared with me almost a year later, long after I'd stopped expecting any new information to surface at all. She called on a Wednesday afternoon while I was at work, and I remember stepping out into the stairwell of my office building to take it, my heart already climbing into my throat before she'd said more than, "Hey, it's Ruiz. Got a minute?" She told me that a woman in Salt Lake City had come forward that spring with a strikingly similar story. A man she'd met on a dating app, photos that turned out to belong to someone else entirely, small unsettling details he shouldn't have known, and eventually a break-in with a note left behind, though in her case the note had been far less gentle in tone. The department out there had connected the cases through a shared digital fingerprint buried in the metadata of one of the fake profile photos, some careless reuse of a cropping tool that had left a trace neither of us would ever have known to look for. They still didn't have him. The Salt Lake City woman, like me, had moved, changed her number, tightened every possible door and window in her life. But knowing that Ruiz had connected the dots, that there was now a pattern on paper instead of just a private, half-doubted feeling in my own chest, mattered to me more than I expected it to. It meant I hadn't imagined the shape of it. It meant somewhere, in some department database, there was a file with my name in it, and hers, side by side, two women in two different cities who had both, at some point, made the mistake of thinking they'd found something easy and good. The case is technically still open. Ruiz still calls every few months to check in, mostly to say there's nothing new, that the trail on the burner numbers keeps going cold, that whoever he really is seems to have gotten very good at becoming someone else the moment a woman gets too close to seeing behind the account. She's told me, gently, that I might never get a real resolution to this, that some cases just end in silence rather than answers, and I've had to learn to live with that in a way I'm still not sure I've fully managed. For a long time afterward, I couldn't sleep with my bedroom window unlocked, even on the third floor of a building with cameras and a doorman, even in a place he had never once been inside of as far as I know. I'd lie there and listen to the pipes settling, the elevator groaning somewhere down the hall, and every ordinary sound would turn itself into a question I couldn't quite answer. I stopped telling new people small details about myself. Favorite coffee shop, apartment number, the little quirks of my daily. Routine. Not because I thought it made sense, exactly, but because some part of me had learned, in the worst possible way, that details are currency. That the wrong person can build an entire convincing person out of nothing but the things you mention offhand in the dead 15 minutes of a Tuesday evening. It's been almost 2 years now. I'm doing better, mostly. I have a life here that finally feels like mine instead of something I'm just storing myself inside of. I have Jess and a few other friends now, and Priya still flies out twice a year, and my mom has stopped asking when she'll get to meet someone because I finally told her the whole story, all of it, and she cried on the phone in a way that made me cry too. But every so often, maybe once every couple of months, always late at night, always when I'm almost asleep, my phone will buzz once, softly, on the nightstand, and for one full, frozen second before I check it, I let myself imagine that it's him, that he's found the new number, the new name, the new floor, and that somewhere out there, whoever he really is, he's been waiting this whole time to see, if I'd stop being careful. It's never him, not once, in 2 years. It's always Jess, or a work email, or a notification from an app I forgot to mute. But I still check every single time. I don't think I'll ever stop checking. And sometimes, on the nights when the building is especially quiet, I think about that folded note on my kitchen table, those 2 words that Jess read to me over the phone in a shaking voice, disappear again. And I wonder how many women came before me in that sentence. How many are out there right now, not knowing yet that they're in it, sitting across from a man at a wine bar somewhere, laughing at a joke, thinking that this, finally, is the easy thing they've been looking for. I hope, if you're reading this and something about your own situation feels a little too familiar, a detail he shouldn't know, a window you're sure you locked, a story that never quite holds together when you try to trace its edges, that you listen to whatever quiet, uncomfortable thing is telling you to look closer. I wish, more than almost anything, that I had listened sooner. I got lucky. I want to be honest about that too, because it would be easy to tell this story as if my own carefulness saved me, and that isn't entirely true. Priya happened to visit when she did. Jess happened to notice the unlocked door before she walked further inside. Officer Ruiz happened to be thorough enough to trace an old, half-forgotten email address back through a years-old data breach that most detectives might not have bothered chasing down. A dozen small, unremarkable pieces of luck lined up in a row, and without any single one of them, I don't know how this story ends, or whether I'd even be the one telling it. So if there's a lesson in any of this, beyond the obvious one about locking your windows and reverse image searching a stranger's photos before you fall for the version of them they've decided to show you, I think it's this. Trust the version of yourself that notices the small wrong thing and wants to say something about it, even when everything else about the situation feels warm and easy and good. That version of you isn't being paranoid. That version of you is paying attention. And sometimes, paying attention is the only thing standing between an ordinary Tuesday and a folded note on your kitchen table, written by someone who was never who he said he was, telling you not to make him disappear again. Story number 2. I want to start by saying I don't fully trust my own memory of this anymore. Not because any of it was hazy in the moment. If anything, I remember those 4 months with a clarity that scares me more than the vague parts do. But because I've gone back over it so many times, looking for the seam where it all started to go wrong, that I'm no longer sure which details are real and which ones I've sharpened into something else just from handling them too much. I'm telling it anyway, because my therapist says that's the only way it stops owning me, and because I think somebody out there needs to hear it before they end up living some version of it themselves. I was 29, living in Portland, 2 years out of a relationship that had ended badly enough that I'd sworn off dating apps entirely. My best friend Mara talked me back into it. Mara and I had known each other since college, the kind of friendship where she could say something cutting about my life choices, and I'd just laugh because I knew it came from love. She'd been using the apps herself for a while, casually, and one night over wine at her place, she took my phone out of my hand, downloaded one, and made me a profile before I could argue. "You're not getting back out there on your own," she said. "You'll just delete it in a week anyway." I didn't delete it. Within 3 days, I'd matched with a man named Ryan. His profile was quiet in a way I found appealing after years of the same 6 gym mirror selfies from every other man on the app. Just 4 photos. One of him reading on a porch somewhere, one at what looked like a friend's backyard barbecue, one hiking with a dog, one a close, unposed shot of him laughing at something out of frame. His bio was short. Trying to remember how to talk to people again. Long story. Ask me sometime. I liked that. It felt honest in a way that didn't try too hard to be honest. We started talking that same night, and within a week it was the kind of conversation I hadn't had with anyone in years. Long, unhurried, full of the specific little admissions people usually save from much further into a relationship. He told me on the third night that the long story in his bio was that he'd lost someone 2 years earlier. Not a breakup, he said. He didn't want to get into it yet, but it was the reason he'd been off the apps, off everything really, for a long time before this. I told him he didn't have to explain anything he wasn't ready to, and he thanked me for that in a way that felt genuinely relieved, like he'd expected me to push. Mara loved hearing about him. Every night I'd recap the conversation for her over text, and she'd send back a string of exclamation points and hard eyes, tell me he sounded perfect, tell me I deserved this after everything with my ex. She asked to see his photos and I sent them over, and she said he was cute, said I should stop overthinking and just meet him already. We met 2.5 weeks in, at a bookstore cafe he suggested, which felt like exactly the right kind of first date for a man whose bio mentioned reading on porches. He was quieter in person than he was over text, but not in an off-putting way. More like someone who'd spent the last 2 years mostly alone and was slowly remembering how to fill a room with his voice again. I found that endearing rather than alarming. We talked for 2 hours, and near the end, he told me a little more about what he'd lost. A fiancé, he said. 3 years earlier, a car accident on a rainy night on the way back from her sister's house. He didn't cry telling me this, but his hands went very still on the table, and I remember reaching over and putting mine on top of one of them, and him looking up at me like I'd done something enormous. I texted Mara from the parking lot afterward, practically vibrating. She said she was so happy for me. She asked a lot of questions that night. What he looked like in person, whether the chemistry was there, what exactly he'd said about his fiancée. More questions than I'd usually expect, but I chalked it up to her being invested, being the kind of friend who wanted every detail. The next 6 weeks were, in a lot of ways, the best 6 weeks of dating I'd ever had. Ryan was attentive without smothering, funny in a dry, understated way, and increasingly open about the fiancé the longer we were together, which felt like trust being built rather than a warning sign. He told me her name was Claire. He told me she'd loved horror movies and hated cilantro and used to leave him little notes in his jacket pockets before work. Small, specific, human details that made the grief feel real rather than performed, and made me feel, in some complicated way, honored that he was sharing them with me at all. It was around week 5 that I started noticing the first thing that didn't sit right, though at the time I filed it under grief being strange rather than anything more sinister. I'd worn a green sweater on our 4th date. Nothing remarkable, just a sweater I liked. Ryan had gone quiet for a moment when he saw me, then recovered and complimented it, but something about his face in that half second before the recovery stayed with me. Later that same week, I mentioned offhand that I was thinking about dyeing my hair a slightly darker shade for fall, and he responded with an intensity that felt disproportionate to the topic. Told me he thought that would look really beautiful on me, asked if I'd send a photo when I did it, in a tone just a little too eager for hypothetical hair. I told Mara about it, half joking. Said something like, "Is it weird that my dead fiancé boyfriend gets weirdly intense about my hair color?" And she laughed it off over text, said grief made people strange, said I was reading into nothing. I believed her. I usually believed Mara about most things. She'd been right about almost everyone I'd ever dated, better at seeing people clearly than I was. The second thing happened at week 7, and this one I couldn't file away as easily. Ryan and I had been official for about 2 weeks by then, and I'd started keeping a few things at his apartment. A toothbrush, a phone charger, a hoodie I'd left after a rainy walk home turned into staying the night. One evening I got there before him, using the spare key he'd given me, and while I was waiting I went looking through his bookshelf, the way you do in someone's apartment when you're bored and curious and starting to feel like you belong there. Tucked behind a row of paperbacks, I found a shoebox. I want to be honest that I shouldn't have opened it, and I've turned that decision over more times than almost anything else in this story, but I did, and inside was a stack of photographs, printed, physical photographs, which felt oddly old-fashioned for someone our age, of a woman I assumed was Claire. Dark hair, a wide, easy smile, photographed at what looked like a dozen different points across what must have been years. Birthday parties, a beach, a Christmas tree, and beneath the photographs, folded at the bottom of the box, a stack of handwritten letters, the paper soft and worn at the folds like they'd been read many times. I didn't read the letters. I told myself that was a line I wouldn't cross, that I'd already crossed enough of one just opening the box, and I put everything back exactly as I'd found it and never mentioned it to Ryan. But I did mention it to Mara later that week, describing the woman in the photos in detail. The dark hair, the smile, the shape of her face. Because something about seeing her had unsettled me in a way I couldn't fully name, and I needed to say it out loud to someone. Mara went quiet on the phone for a moment. Then she said, in a voice that sounded strange even before I understood why, "That's so sad. I'm sorry you saw that. I didn't think anything of the pause at the time. I think about it constantly now." The third thing, the thing that actually made me start pulling at threads instead of just noticing them, happened at week 10, on a night I'd gone over to Ryan's unannounced, wanting to surprise him after a long week at work. I let myself in with the spare key, expecting him to be at his desk the way he usually was in the evenings, and instead found him standing very still in his bedroom, in front of the mirror, wearing a woman's cardigan over his own shirt, buttoned all the way up. He didn't hear me come in. I stood in the doorway for what felt like an unbearably long time before he noticed my reflection behind his in the mirror. And when he did, his face did something I still don't have a good word for. Not embarrassment, exactly, and not fear, but something closer to a mask slipping and being caught in the act of slipping. He took the cardigan off immediately, folded it with a strange, careful tenderness, and told me it had been Claire's, that sometimes, on the hardest nights, putting it on made him feel like he could still smell her on it, like some small part of the grief eased. I told him I understood. I even believed, in the moment, that I did. Grief does strange things to people. I'd read enough about it to know that mourning doesn't always look like what you'd expect from the outside. I hugged him, and we didn't talk about it again, and I told myself I'd been the intruder in that moment, not him, and that I owed him the grace of not making it weirder than it already was for him. I didn't tell Mara about this one. I'm still not entirely sure why. Some instinct, maybe, that this particular detail belonged only to me and to him, or maybe some earlier, quieter version of the doubt that was starting to build, telling me not to hand this piece of the story to anyone else yet. In between the cardigan and the phone call, there was one more evening I need to describe, because I've come to think of it as the moment I stopped being able to tell myself I hadn't noticed anything. It was a Sunday, and Ryan had gone out to pick up dinner, leaving me alone in his apartment for maybe 20 minutes, and instead of scrolling my phone on his couch the way I normally would have, I found myself standing in front of that bookshelf again, staring at the exact spot where the shoebox lived, feeling a pull toward it that I recognized, even then, as something closer to dread than curiosity. I didn't open the box again. What I did instead, almost without deciding to, was open the search bar on my own phone and type Claire's first name alongside the little I actually knew. The general region she was supposedly from, the approximate years Ryan had mentioned. Nothing came back that matched cleanly. No obituary, no wedding announcement, no easily findable social media trail at all, which I told myself at the time simply meant she'd deleted everything after the breakup, the way plenty of people do. It didn't occur to me yet, not fully, that the complete absence of a living woman's digital footprint could be its own kind of red flag rather than an absence of evidence. I know better now. I've read enough since then to know that a person who has genuinely, deliberately vanished from the internet on their own terms usually leaves faint traces anyway. An old tagged photo on a friend's account, a half-abandoned account of their own, some sediment layer of a life that doesn't erase as cleanly as people think. What I found instead was closer to nothing at all, a silence too clean to be accidental, and I stood there in his kitchen with my phone in my hand feeling a low, specific unease I didn't have a name for yet, and then I heard his key in the lock and closed the app and slid my phone into my pocket like I'd been caught at something, even though, in that moment, I still believed I had nothing real to hide from him. I told myself, driving home that night, that I would ask him directly the next time it came up naturally, that I owed him the basic decency of asking instead of quietly investigating a grief he trusted me with. I never got the chance to ask him naturally, because 2 weeks later, everything changed at once, in the space of about 48 hours, and looking back, I think that period is really where the story actually starts, even though it took me months afterward to understand that everything before it had just been the careful, patient setup for what came next. It started with a phone call from a number I didn't recognize, a woman's voice, tight and urgent, asking if I was the person currently seeing a man named Ryan. When I said yes, cautiously, she told me her name was Diane, and that she was Claire's mother. Claire, she told me, hadn't died in a car accident 3 years ago. Claire had left Ryan 4 years ago, alive and, as far as Diane knew, still very much alive somewhere across the country, after what Diane described only as things that got very bad very fast during their year together. Diane had found me through a mutual friend of a friend, some thread she'd pulled after hearing, secondhand, that Ryan was seeing someone new, something she said she'd promised herself she'd do every single time she heard it happen again. Reach out, warn the woman, try to undo even a little of what she felt guilty for not having done sooner with someone else, some other name Diane wouldn't tell me, some other woman further back in a pattern I was only now learning I was standing inside of. I didn't believe her at first. I want to be honest about that too. My first instinct was that this was some kind of scam, or some jealous ex-something reaching for a story cruel enough to sabotage a happy relationship, and I told her as much, my voice shaking despite myself. She didn't argue with me. She just said, very quietly, ask him what happened to the dog in the hiking photo, and hung up. I hadn't told Diane about the hiking photo. I hadn't told anyone about the hiking photo, the one on his profile of him with a golden retriever mix, a detail so small I'd barely registered it myself beyond a passing, appreciative glance the very first night I looked at his profile. There was no way Diane could have known about that photo unless she had actually known Ryan, actually been close enough to his life to know the specific images he used to construct himself for women online. That night, I sat on my own bathroom floor with my phone in my hands for almost 2 hours before I called Mara. She picked up on the second ring, and I told her everything. The shoebox, the cardigan, the phone call from Diane, the hiking photo I'd never mentioned to a living soul beyond a passing comment months ago. I expected her to be as shaken as I was. Instead, there was a long silence on the line, long enough that I asked if she was still there, and when she finally spoke, her voice had changed into something I'd never heard from her before, flat and careful, in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up before she'd even said anything specific. I need you to not freak out, she said, but I already knew some of this. I want to describe what that sentence did to me as precisely as I can, because it is, to this day, the single worst moment of the entire ordeal, worse even than what came after. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was a kind of vertigo, the specific horror of realizing that the ground you'd been standing on with total confidence for years, an entire friendship, over a decade of it, had never been quite as solid as you thought, and that you had no idea, in that instant, how far down the soft spot actually went. Mara told me, in pieces, over the next hour, that she had dated Ryan herself, briefly, almost 2 years earlier, before I'd ever met him, back before he'd been calling himself Ryan at all. She'd known him under a different name then. She said it had ended badly, that she'd blocked him everywhere, that she genuinely believed, when she saw his photos on my phone that first week, that it couldn't possibly be the same man. A different name, a slightly different haircut, a different city listed on his profile, and had convinced herself it was just an unsettling coincidence rather than say anything and risk sounding insane or worse. Risk me thinking she was jealous, trying to sabotage something good for me out of her own bad history. But that wasn't the part that finally broke something loose in my chest. The part that did that came a few minutes later, when I asked her, my voice barely working, why she'd kept asking me so many detailed questions about him over these last 2 months if she'd suspected all along. The silence that followed was different from the first one, longer, heavier. I wanted to know if it was really him, she finally said. I needed to be sure before I said anything. I didn't want to blow up your relationship over a maybe. I believe that explanation for exactly as long as it took her to keep talking because she kept talking, the way people do when they've decided, somewhere in the middle of a confession, that they might as well finish it. She told me that after their relationship had ended 2 years earlier, he hadn't fully let her go. That there had been months of messages from numbers she didn't recognize, small, unsettling gifts left at her door, a period where she genuinely believed someone was following her, though she'd never been able to prove any of it was him. She had never told me any of this. In 10 years of friendship, in a dozen conversations about past relationships, she had never once mentioned a man who sounded like this. And now I understood, sitting on my bathroom floor with the phone shaking against my ear, exactly why. Because some part of her had never fully closed that door, had kept a strange, unexamined thread of contact running quietly underneath the surface of her life, checking his social media sometimes late at night, the way you pick at something healed over precisely because it's healed, and picking feels safe. And when she'd seen his photos on my phone that first week, really seen them, not glanced at them the way she claimed, some old, unresolved part of her hadn't warned me at all. It had wanted to watch, wanted to know, from a safe distance, what it would look like this time played out on someone else, someone she loved but who wasn't her, someone whose pain she could witness instead of live through herself. She told me this crying, apologizing over and over, and I believed the apology was real, even as I understood, with a clarity that made me feel physically sick, that it didn't matter whether it was real, because for 2 months my best friend had known, or at least deeply suspected, exactly who I was falling in love with, and had let me keep falling anyway. I didn't go back to my apartment that night. I couldn't stand the idea of being anywhere I associated with either of them, so I checked into a hotel, alone, and didn't tell Mara where I was, and didn't tell Ryan anything at all. He texted twice that evening, normal, warm texts, asking how my day had gone, and I stared at both of them for a long time before finally typing back a single line. I know about Claire. I know she's not dead. His response came almost instantly, far too fast for someone genuinely blindsided by that sentence, which was its own small, cold data point I filed away even through the fog of everything else. He said he could explain that it wasn't what it looked like, that dead had been a kind of metaphor he'd never quite figured out how to walk back once he'd said it that first night at the bookstore cafe, that the real Claire leaving him had felt like a death, and he hadn't known how to explain that without the word attached to it. It was, I'll admit, a coherent enough explanation that some small, exhausted, still hopeful part of me almost wanted to accept it. Then he asked me something that ended any chance of that. He asked whether Diane had called me, and if so, what exactly she'd said. I hadn't told him about Diane's call. I had said nothing in my message about her at all. I didn't respond after that. I turned my phone off entirely and lay in that hotel bed with the chain on the door and the desk chair wedged under the handle for good measure. And I didn't sleep, not really, just drifted in and out of a kind of watchful half-consciousness until the light came up gray through the curtains. The next morning, I called Diane back. She was kind, careful, clearly practiced at having this exact conversation, which was its own quiet horror. The idea that she'd had to learn how to deliver this particular warning smoothly because she'd delivered some version of it before. She told me Ryan's real name, which I won't put here, and told me that as far as she knew, there had been at least 2 other women since Claire. Since her. Since the real story behind the fiancé he described. That she'd managed to track down and warn. Women whose names she'd found the same slow, patient way she'd found mine, through the thin, overlapping threads of mutual friends and old social. Accounts he never fully managed to erase. She told me one more thing before we hung up. Something she said almost apologetically, like she hated having to add it to everything else she'd already unloaded on me. She said that in her experience, in the pattern she'd watched play out 3 times now, the women he chose weren't random. He looked for a very specific type. Dark-haired, a particular shape to the face, a particular kind of laugh, she said. Something in the way we carried ourselves that reminded him, consciously or not, of Claire, the actual living woman who had actually, genuinely left him. Every version after her, Diane believed, wasn't really a new relationship at all. It was an attempt to rerun the same story with a different ending, an ending where the woman didn't leave, where she stayed no matter what he showed her, no matter what she found in a shoebox behind his books. I thought, sitting there in that hotel room, about the cardigan, about the mask slipping in the mirror, about how careful, how patient the entire architecture of him had been from the very first message about my hiking photo, and I understood, with a fresh, deeper wave of nausea, that I had never actually been the person he was falling for at all. I had been cast. Before I filed anything, I asked Diane one more question. The one that had been sitting underneath everything else since the moment she'd said the word again on the phone. I asked her how many other women there had actually been. Not the vague a couple she'd offered before, but a real number. Because some part of me needed to know exactly how large the pattern was that I'd apparently walked into. She was quiet for a moment, and then she told me she genuinely didn't know the full count. That she only knew about the ones she'd personally managed to trace, which was 3 including me, but that she strongly suspected there were others she'd never found, women who had simply moved on, changed their numbers, and never spoken publicly about any of it, the way most people don't, the way I probably wouldn't have either if this had ended slightly differently. She told me one of the other 2 women had eventually stopped responding to her altogether, months after her own warning call, and that Diane had never been able to confirm whether that silence meant the woman had simply wanted to move past the whole ordeal, or something worse, that she tried very hard, she said, not to let herself imagine on the bad nights. I filed a police report that same day, and this time, with Diane's account and the pattern she described backing me up, the response was faster than it had been for anyone else in this story before me, or so I hoped. An officer took a full statement, took photographs of the messages, made a note of the shoebox and the letters I described, though of course I had no legal way to have taken any of it myself. I gave them the name Diane had given me, and within a week they'd confirmed enough of it to open a real investigation. His actual identity, an actual history that included, buried in an old file from another state, a stalking complaint filed years earlier by a woman whose case had gone nowhere for lack of evidence, exactly the kind of quiet, unresolved thread Diane had warned me about. Ryan didn't disappear immediately the way the man from every other story like this one seems to. For about 10 days, the messages kept coming. Not threatening, not at first, just increasingly desperate, then increasingly strange, describing things he couldn't have known unless he'd been closer to my daily life than I wanted to imagine. Small details about my new hotel's lobby, about a coffee order at a shop I'd only been to twice. I moved twice more during that stretch, each time telling fewer people where I'd gone, until the only person who knew my location at all was the detective assigned to my case. Mara wasn't one of those people. Not by then. I hadn't cut her off entirely. Some raw, complicated loyalty from a decade of friendship kept me from doing that as cleanly as I probably should have. But I had stopped telling her anything real, stopped trusting the version of concern she offered over text, watching every question she asked with a new, cold kind of scrutiny I hated having to apply to someone I'd loved for so long. It was almost 3 weeks after Diane's first call that the messages from Ryan finally stopped, all at once, the way a radio station cuts to static. The detective told me, carefully, that they traced his last known location to a bus station 2 states away, that the trail after that went cold the way these trails so often do, that there wasn't enough for a warrant yet, that I should keep documenting everything and stay careful. The same tired, insufficient advice I'd already heard a version of once before in my life and would apparently go on. Hearing for the rest of it. Here's the part I still haven't found a way to say out loud to very many people, the part that turns everything before it into something worse than even I understood at the time. About 6 months after the messages stopped, long after I'd moved to a new apartment across the city, long after I'd started, tentatively, sleeping through full nights again, I ran into Diane by accident. Not the warning phone call kind of running into her. An actual coincidence at a farmer's market on a Saturday morning, both of us reaching for the same bin of peaches at the same moment. She recognized me before I recognized her, and we ended up getting coffee together at a little stand nearby. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, gently, almost sadly, she told me something she said she'd debated whether to ever tell me at all. She told me that the story she'd given me about Claire, the leaving, the year of things that got very bad very fast, hadn't been the whole truth either. She told me that Claire hadn't simply left him. Claire had disappeared 4.5 years ago and had never been found, and that Diane, Her mother had spent every year since trying to build a case against the man she was certain was responsible, a case that had never once produced enough evidence to charge him with anything, because he was, Diane said, the most patient, careful person she had ever encountered in her life, patient enough to wait years between women, patient enough to let a case go cold and then quietly, methodically, start again somewhere new. I asked her, my coffee going cold in my hands, why she'd told me the softer version on the phone that first time. She said she'd been afraid that if she told me the real story first, a woman gone, actually gone, not metaphorically dead, but missing, presumed by her own mother to be dead in some ditch, somewhere he'd chosen carefully enough that it would never be found. I would have been too frightened to act quickly, too frozen to do the practical things that might actually keep me safe. She'd learned, over 3 warnings to 3 different women, that fear delivered too fast made people freeze instead of move, and that a smaller, more survivable horror got people out the door faster than the full one ever could. I sat with that for a long time after she left. I still sit with it, more than a year later, on the nights when the building settles in a way that sounds, for one bad half-second, like a footstep in the hallway outside my new apartment in a city I moved to specifically because no one from my old life knew I'd gone there. Mara doesn't know where I live now. I let that friendship end the way you let a wound close over something that's still, somewhere underneath, not quite finished healing. Imperfectly, with a scar that aches sometimes for no clear reason. The investigation, as far as I know, is still open, in the loose, technical sense that these things stay open for years without ever really moving. A file sitting in a drawer somewhere with my name in it, and Diane's, and Claire's, and however many names came before Claire that none of us have ever found. I don't know where he is. I don't know if the woman he's with now, if there is one, knows the real length of the shoebox behind his books, or the real reason the fiancé in the photographs never quite meets your eyes in any of them, like even in still images she already knew, on some level, what was coming. What I keep coming back to, more than the fear, more even than Mara's betrayal, is something Diane said to me that morning at the farmer's market, almost as an afterthought, right before she hugged me goodbye and walked off into the crowd. She said that in her experience, the women he chose weren't just chosen for how they looked. They were chosen, she believed, for something underneath that. An openness, a hunger to be truly seen after a long stretch of loneliness, the exact quality that had made Claire fall for him in the first place, all those years ago, before any of this had a name. I think about that a lot, on nights I can't sleep. I think about how the thing that made me vulnerable to him wasn't a flaw exactly, wasn't carelessness, wasn't anything I could have simply trained myself out of. It was the same ordinary, human wish that puts any of us on those apps in the first place. The wish to be known, to be chosen, to matter to somebody specific in a world that mostly moves past you without noticing. He understood that wish better than almost anyone I've ever met, understood exactly how to reflect it back at a woman until she couldn't tell anymore where her own hope ended and his construction of her began. I don't know if that makes what happened to me worse or somehow, in some small way, less personal. The idea that I wasn't singled out for anything uniquely wrong with me, only for being exactly as human and exactly as lonely as everyone else he'd chosen before me. And, I have to assume, everyone he's chosen since. 2 nights ago, for the first time in almost a year, my phone buzzed at 1 a.m. with a message from a number I didn't recognize. I sat up in bed so fast I knocked my water glass off the nightstand, and my hands were shaking too badly to unlock the screen for almost a full minute. When I finally did, the message just said, "Wrong number! Sorry!" An ordinary, harmless mistake, the kind that happens to everyone, that means nothing at all. I still haven't deleted it. I don't think I'm going to. I think some part of me needs to keep it there, glowing faintly on my lock screen every time I check the time in the dark, as a reminder that the fear doesn't actually go away just because the messages stop, that it just goes quiet for a while, waiting, the same patient way I now understand he waits, for the next unremarkable Tuesday when I let my guard down enough to believe, even for a moment, that this is finally, safely over. My therapist asked me recently whether I thought I would ever trust that kind of quiet again, and I honestly didn't know how to answer her. I want to say yes, because the alternative is a version of the rest of my life that sounds unbearable, even to me, spent flinching at wrong numbers and footsteps in hallways and the particular hush of an apartment building settling at night. But I also can't unknow what I know now, which is that the ordinary, boring silence I used to take for granted, no messages, no unlocked windows, no strange cars idling too long outside my building, was never actually safety. It was only ever the space between one patient man's moves, and I have no way of knowing. Not really, whether I'm standing in that space right now, or whether I've simply gotten better at not looking too closely at the edges of it. Some nights that thought is almost peaceful. In a strange way, the way accepting any large uncertain thing eventually becomes peaceful. Other nights it is the only thought in my head, circling long after I should have fallen asleep. Story number 3. I've told this story out loud exactly twice. Once to a police detective in a cold interview room, and once to my mother over the phone, both times in a voice that didn't sound entirely like my own. Writing it down feels different, slower, like I finally have the room to say all of it, instead of just the parts that fit into a police report or a mother's need for reassurance. So I'm going to tell it the way it actually happened, in order, even the parts that still make my hands shake a little when I type them. My name is Sarah Whitman. I was 28 that fall, working night shifts as a nurse at a hospital outside Nashville, which meant my entire social life had shrunk down to a handful of coworkers, a group text with 2 college friends who'd both moved away years earlier, and my roommate, Amanda Carter, who I'd known since nursing school and who worked days at the same hospital, which meant we mostly saw each other in the 15-minute overlap of a shift change. Amanda was the one who got me on the app, the same way these stories always seem to start, and I don't say that as a criticism of her. She meant well, she'd had decent luck with it herself, and she was tired of watching me come home from 12-hour shifts to an empty apartment and immediately fall asleep on the couch with the TV still on. You need something in your life that isn't work, she told me one morning over coffee, already half out the door for her shift. Just look. You don't have to do anything with it. I looked. 3 days later, I matched with a man named Jason Bennett. His profile felt different from the others in a way I noticed immediately. Not slicker, exactly, just more specific. A photo of him at what looked like a family lake house, squinting into the sun with a fishing rod in one hand. A photo in scrubs, captioned, "Yes, those are real. No, I will not diagnose your rash over text." A photo of him and an older woman I assumed was his mother, both of them laughing at something. His bio said he was a physical therapist, 30 years old, originally from a small town in Kentucky, in Nashville for work. It ended with, "Looking for someone who won't get weird about my job when I ask to see your knees on the first date." I'm kidding. Mostly. I laughed out loud in my kitchen reading that. I matched with him immediately, and he messaged first. Something easy about the scrubs picture, and within an hour we'd fallen into the kind of rhythm you don't often get with a stranger. Quick, funny, a little flirty, both of us clearly enjoying it rather than performing enjoyment for each other. It helped that we had the medical field in common. We spent that first week comparing notes on difficult patients, terrible coworkers, the specific exhaustion of a 12-hour shift on your feet, and it felt less like dating and more like finding someone who already understood a language most people didn't speak. Amanda teased me relentlessly about how much I was smiling at my phone that week, and I let her, because it was true and I didn't care. There was a particular night, maybe 5 days in, that I still think about now with a kind of retroactive unease I didn't feel at the time. I'd had a rough shift. A patient coding twice before we finally stabilized him. The kind of night that leaves you hollowed out and shaky even hours after you clock out. And I texted Jason mostly out of habit, not expecting much beyond a sympathetic emoji. Instead, he called me at 11 at night and stayed on the phone with me for almost 2 hours while I cried a little and talked through what had happened. And he didn't try to fix it or rush me past it. Just listened, asked good questions, told me a story of his own about a physical therapy patient he'd lost years earlier that he said he still thought about sometimes. It was, at the time, the single most comforting conversation I'd had with anyone in longer than I wanted to admit. Looking back, though, I've turned that phone call over more than almost any other memory from those first weeks, because of how naturally he slipped into exactly the right tone for a stranger to hit on a first real conversation about death. Not rehearsed, not performed, but so precisely calibrated to what I needed in that moment that it's hard now not to wonder how much practice it had actually taken to get that good at it. We met in person after about 10 days at a diner near my apartment that stayed open late enough to work around both our schedules. He looked like his photos, which after 2 friends' warnings about catfishing felt like a genuine relief, and he was, if anything, more charming in person. Quick with a joke, easy to talk to, the kind of attentive that made you feel like the only person in the room. We talked for almost 3 hours, closing the diner down, and when he walked me to my car, he didn't try to kiss me, just squeezed my hand and said he hoped this wasn't the last time. And I remember thinking, driving home, that I hadn't felt this specific, uncomplicated kind of hopeful in a very long time. The next month went the way good things go when you're not yet looking for the cracks in them. We saw each other 2 or 3 times a week, working around both our schedules, texting through the dead hours of overnight shifts when neither of us could sleep. He told me, gradually, about his family. A mother, Linda, still in Kentucky, and a brother, Chris, who he mentioned only briefly and always with a strange, clipped tone that made it clear, without him saying so directly, that there was history there he wasn't ready to get into. "We don't really talk," he told me once, when I asked, lying on his couch with my head in his lap, half paying attention to whatever was playing on TV. "It's complicated. Twin stuff." I didn't push. I figured, the way you do, that I'd learn more eventually, that some things take time to hand over, and I was more interested, honestly, in the fact that he was a twin at all. I'd never known one before, and I asked him a handful of harmless questions about it, whether they dressed alike as kids, whether people still mixed them up, and he answered most of them lightly enough, though something in. His face tightened slightly every time the conversation lingered there too long. The first thing that unsettled me happened about 5 weeks in, and it was small enough that I almost didn't mention it to anyone. I was at the grocery store near my apartment, the kind of ordinary Tuesday errand that doesn't usually stay in your memory, when a woman near the deli counter did a visible double take at me, then walked over, apologizing before she'd even fully arrived. "I'm so sorry," she said. "This is going to sound so strange, but are you dating Jason Bennett?" I said yes, cautiously, and she laughed, relieved, and introduced herself as Melissa, said she used to cut Jason's hair at a salon downtown, hadn't seen him in probably a year, and that I looked exactly like the kind of woman he always went for. I laughed it off, said something polite, and we parted ways, and I didn't think much of it beyond a small, warm little validation. Proof that he was a real, known person with an actual life in this city, not some elaborate fiction. It was only a few days later, telling Amanda about the encounter over coffee, that she asked a question that snagged in a way I hadn't expected. "Wait," she said, "did she say Jason used to get his hair cut there, or that a Jason used to?" I didn't remember precisely. It felt like a strange thing to interrogate over something so small, and I told her as much, and she let it go, though I noticed she didn't fully let it go, the way I'd come to recognize Amanda doing when something bothered her more than she wanted to admit out loud. The second thing happened about 2 weeks after that, and this one I couldn't laugh off quite as easily. I'd started spending nights at Jason's apartment fairly regularly by then, and one evening, while he was in the shower, I noticed his phone light up on the nightstand with a text preview, the kind of thing you're not supposed to look at, but that catches your eye anyway before you can stop it. The name on the screen was Mom, and the preview read, "Please stop doing this. He would not want this. Call me back." I told myself it was nothing. A mother's ordinary worry about an adult son, maybe something about Chris, the estranged twin, maybe some old family conflict that had nothing to do with me at all. When Jason came out of the shower, I didn't mention it, and the conversation moved easily into something else, and I let the moment slide into the general, forgivable static of not knowing everything about someone you've only been dating for 7 weeks. I want to be honest that even after that, even after the strange text and Melissa's slightly too warm recognition at the grocery store, I wasn't looking for anything wrong. I was happy. That's the part that's hardest to explain to people who ask why I didn't see it sooner. Not that I missed the signs entirely, but that happiness has its own kind of gravity. And I was so relieved to finally feel it again after years of 12-hour shifts and an empty apartment that I let each small strange thing get pulled into orbit around it instead of standing on its own. There was one more thing, smaller than the others, that I only remembered clearly much later, turning the whole timeline back over in my head the way you do after everything falls apart. About a month in, Jason had taken me to a barbecue place his coworkers apparently swore by, a little out-of-the-way spot on the edge of town, and partway through dinner an older man at the next table had stopped by ours, clapped Jason on the shoulder, and said, warmly, "Good to see you back around. Man, it's been a while." Jason had smiled, said something vague and friendly back, and the man had moved on, and I hadn't thought anything of it. Coworkers run into each other. That's what coworkers do. It was only months later, lying awake, replaying every scrap of that relationship, that I remembered the exact phrase the man had used. Back around. Not good to see you, the way you'd greet someone you saw every week. Back around, the way you'd greet someone who'd been gone a long time, and had only recently, cautiously, started reappearing in a life he used to belong to. I also think now about how careful he was, in a way I mistook for simple modesty, about photos. I have almost nothing from those 7 weeks beyond a couple of blurry candids I took myself without asking. No posed pictures together, no photos he'd taken of himself and sent me, even when I asked, half joking, why he never sent selfies the way most guys did. He always had an answer ready, self-deprecating, something about not photographing well, and I always let it go, charmed rather than suspicious, because everything else about him felt so present, so real, so entirely there in the room with me, that the absence of photographic evidence never once registered as an absence of anything at all. The third thing is the one that finally broke that orbit apart completely, and it happened on a night I wasn't even supposed to be at his apartment. I'd had a shift canceled unexpectedly, a scheduling mix-up that gave me an unplanned evening free, and I decided to surprise him, using the spare key he'd given me a few weeks earlier. He wasn't home when I let myself in. Working late, I assumed, since he sometimes picked up evening sessions with patients who couldn't make daytime appointments. I made myself comfortable on his couch, scrolling my phone, and after about 20 minutes, out of nothing but idle boredom, I opened his laptop, which he'd left on the coffee table, still logged into his email. I want to say clearly that I know this was a violation, the same way I knew it the last time I told a story like this one, and I've made my peace with the fact that I did it anyway, because what I found changed the entire shape of what came after. There was an email thread, several messages deep, between Jason's account and an address that belonged, according to the signature at the bottom of each message, to a grief counselor. The most recent message, from 3 days earlier, read, "Chris, I understand this is difficult, but continuing to use your brother's accounts and identity isn't a healthy way to process what happened. I'd strongly encourage you to come back in for another session before this goes further." I sat very still on that couch for a long time after reading it, the laptop glowing in my lap, the apartment silent around me in a way it had never felt silent before. Jason wasn't Jason. He was Chris. And somewhere in that email, buried in a sentence I read 4 or 5 times trying to make it mean something else, was the word brother, present tense in one clause and unmistakably, chillingly past tense in the next. Using your brother's accounts, using what happened, as though the two of them weren't simply estranged the way he'd told me, as though something much worse than a falling out had actually occurred. I heard his key in the door before I'd fully processed any of it, and I didn't have time to close the laptop or compose my face into anything convincing. He stopped in the doorway when he saw me, and something in his expression shifted immediately, some careful mask dropping the same way I'd later come to recognize as a pattern in stories like mine, though at the time I only knew that the man standing in front of me suddenly looked like a stranger wearing a face I'd spent 7 weeks falling for. "I can explain," he said, which is, I've learned, what they all say, in this specific order, in this specific tone, as though the explanation has been sitting ready in their mouth the entire time, waiting for the moment it would finally be needed. He told me, sitting across from me at his own kitchen table, that his name was Christopher Bennett, that he was, in fact, a twin, but that the twin, the real Jason, the one in the fishing photo, the one in the scrubs, the one whose mother had raised them both in that small town in Kentucky, had died 2 years earlier. A car accident, he said, late at night, a patch of ice on a back road none of them had driven often enough to know was dangerous. He said that afterward, he hadn't known how to be a person anymore, that everyone in his life had expected him to grieve in a specific, forward-moving way, and that some broken, desperate part of him had started, almost by accident at first, logging into his brother's old accounts just to look at them, to feel close to something that still felt alive in pixels even after it had stopped being alive everywhere else. He said the dating profile had started the same way. An accident, almost scrolling through his brother's old messages one night and finding himself, before he'd fully decided to. Swiping through the app under his brother's name, his brother's photos, telling himself it was harmless, a strange kind of tribute, a way of letting some part of Jason keep existing in the world a little longer through him. It is, I'll admit, a story constructed carefully enough to almost work, delivered with enough genuine-looking grief that some small, exhausted part of me wanted to believe it, wanted to reach across the table and comfort a man drowning in a loss I could at least imagine the shape of. I might have believed it entirely, might have found some way to be angry and understanding at once, and eventually forgiven my way back into this relationship with a slightly different name attached to it if I hadn't already read that grief counselor's email with my own eyes, if the phrase continuing to use your brother's accounts hadn't specifically, deliberately implied a pattern stretching back, further than the 7 weeks I'd personally lived through. I asked him directly whether I was the first woman he'd done this with. He didn't answer right away, which was its own answer, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone flat in a way that scared me more than anything he'd said so far. He told me there had been a couple of others, his phrase, delivered with a strange, clinical distance, as though he were describing patients rather than women he'd built entire fabricated relationships with under a dead man's name. He said it never lasted long. He said something always eventually gave it away. A slip, a coincidence. Someone from Jason's old life recognizing a face that shouldn't have still been circulating through the world attached to a stranger's number. I asked him, my voice shaking in a way I couldn't control by that point, what he did when it fell apart. What happened, exactly, in the space between one woman figuring it out and the next profile going up under his brother's name. He looked at me for a long moment before answering, and something about the pause made me regret asking before he'd even said a word. He told me he usually took a break, a few weeks, sometimes longer, to get his head right. That was the phrase he used, get his head right, and that eventually the apartment would get too quiet, and the grief counselor's emails would start piling up unread, and he'd find himself, almost without deciding to, opening the app again, scrolling through his brother's old photos, choosing the ones that made Jason look the most alive. I asked him if he'd ever told any of the others the truth voluntarily, the way he was telling me now, or if every single one of them had found out the way I had. By accident? By a slipped laptop screen? By a stranger at a grocery store who remembered a face that didn't belong to the name attached to it? He said no. He said I was the first one he'd actually explained himself to instead of just disappearing on. And for one brief, disorienting moment, sitting across that kitchen table from him, I felt something that horrified me more than anything else that night. A small, traitorous flicker of something like flattery, like being trusted with the truth, was its own kind of intimacy before the rest of me caught up and recognized it for what it actually was, which was simply a different, more sophisticated shape of the same manipulation that had gotten me into that kitchen in the first place. I left that night and I didn't go back. And for the first few days, I told myself the worst of it was simply the deception itself, the sheer violation of having built real feelings for a man who had never actually existed under the name I knew him by. I filed a report, mostly out of a sense that this needed to be documented somewhere official, even if I wasn't sure what crime, exactly, had been committed. And the officer who took my statement was sympathetic, but understandably, uncertain what to actually do with a case built around a man using his own dead brother's identity rather than a stranger's. It was Melissa, the woman from the grocery store, the one who'd cut Jason's hair, who found me a week later, not by accident this time. She'd gotten my number from Amanda, who she'd tracked down through a mutual friend, and when she called, her voice had none of the warm, easy familiarity it had at the deli counter. It was careful, urgent, the voice of someone who had clearly rehearsed what she needed to say. She told me that she hadn't cut Jason's hair. Not really. She'd cut Chris's hair for almost a year, back when Chris had first started slipping into his brother's identity. She just hadn't known that at the time, because Chris had introduced himself to her from the very first appointment as Jason, and she'd had no reason to question it, because she'd never met the real Jason at all. She only found out the truth months into their own relationship, which had started, she told me, almost exactly the way mine had. An app, an easy connection, a man who seemed to understand grief and loneliness in a way that felt like it was speaking directly to her own. She told me she'd ended things the same week she'd found out, horrified, and had spent the year since trying to convince herself it had just been an unusually strange, unusually cruel act of grief. A man so broken by loss that he'd temporarily lost his own name in the process. She said she genuinely believed that, mostly, until 3 months ago, when a coworker of hers had mentioned, in passing, an old news article she'd stumbled across while looking up something unrelated. A small local story from Kentucky, almost 3 years old now, about a young man's death that the family had initially reported as a car accident, and that had later, quietly, without much follow-up coverage, been reclassified by investigators as an open case pending further review. I asked her what that meant, though some cold, sinking part of me had already started to understand. She said that as far as she'd been able to find, no formal charges had ever been filed, no arrest had ever been made, and the case had simply gone quiet the way small-town cases sometimes do when a family closes ranks and a community decides it's kinder not to keep asking questions. But she said the timeline had stuck with her ever since she'd read it. The accident that killed Jason Bennett had happened only 6 weeks before Chris first created the fake profile that eventually found her, as though whatever grief had driven him to become his brother had started forming almost the exact moment his brother stopped being able to stop him. Melissa told me something else that night, too. Something that had clearly been sitting heavy in her for a long time before she finally said it out loud to me. She said that near the end of her own relationship with him, before she knew any of the truth, back when he was still, as far as she understood it, simply Jason, there had been a night he drank more than she'd ever seen him drink, and had said something strange and slurred about his brother that she'd filed away at the time as ordinary sibling resentment. He'd said, "Chris always wanted what was mine, even now." She hadn't thought much of it in the moment, she told me, because plenty of people talk about difficult siblings that way, a little bitterly, a little dramatically, after a few drinks. It was only after everything came apart that she understood the sentence had been backward the entire time, that Chris hadn't been the brother he was complaining about. Chris was him. The Jason complaining about Chris wanting what was his had, impossibly, been Chris the entire time, slipping for one drunken moment out of the person he was pretending to be and into some fractured, resentful version of the brother he'd actually lost, as though even his own drunken complaints had gotten tangled up in whichever identity happened to be sitting closest to the surface that night. I asked her the question I'd been almost afraid to ask since she first mentioned the reclassified case, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. I asked whether she thought Chris had actually done something to Jason, caused the accident, somehow, rather than simply losing him to bad luck and a patch of ice on a back road. She was quiet for a long moment before she answered, and when she finally did, her voice had lost all of its earlier composure. She said she didn't know, that she'd never let herself follow that thought all the way to the end because of where it led, but that she'd started to notice, the longer she sat with everything, how conveniently complete the takeover had been, how quickly, how thoroughly, how comfortably Chris had settled into a name and a face and an entire remaining life that had, until 6 weeks earlier, belonged to someone else entirely, someone who, by his own drunken slip of the tongue, he'd apparently spent years resenting. I didn't sleep much for the next several nights after that call. I kept circling back to something, Chris. I still struggle to call him that. Even now, some old muscle memory in my chest still wanting to reach for the other name, had said to me at his kitchen table that last night, something I'd filed away at the time as simple, ordinary grief, but that now sat differently in my memory. He told me that he and Jason had never actually been close, not the way people assume twins are close, that there had been a long, complicated tension between them for years before the accident, something about a woman they'd both once been interested in back in Kentucky, something he'd said quickly and then moved past before I could ask a follow-up question. I went back to the police with everything. Melissa's account, the reclassified case in Kentucky, the pattern of at least 2 other women besides myself. The detective assigned to my case this time, a woman named Rachel Owens, was more thorough than I expected, and within a couple of weeks, she'd managed to get in touch with the original investigating department in Kentucky, reopening a conversation about a case that, as far as I could tell, had been sitting untouched for close to 2 years. I never got a clean resolution to any of it, and I think that's the part of this story I still have the hardest time making peace with, more than the deception, more even than Melissa's account of the same slow, careful ruin playing out a year before mine. The Kentucky case remains open, technically, the same word every detective in every story like mine seems to use, a word that means both something and almost nothing at the same time. Chris was never charged with anything related to his brother's death. There wasn't enough evidence to charge him with anything beyond what amounted to a strange, unsettling pattern of behavior that wasn't, in itself, clearly illegal, using a dead man's photos and a dead man's name to build relationships with women who had no way of knowing they were speaking to a ghost replacement rather than the ghost himself. He did stop contacting me after Rachel Owens got involved, at least directly. But about 4 months after everything came apart, Amanda came home from a shift with a strange look on her face and told me she'd seen a profile on the app that had made her stomach drop. A man who looked almost, though not quite, like Jason's photos, a slightly different jawline, a different last name, a bio that mentioned, in the exact same careful, practiced cadence I remembered from those first messages, a brother he'd lost and didn't like to talk about yet. I don't know if it was actually him under a new name or a coincidence cruel enough to feel like one, or my own frightened mind finding a pattern in something that might have meant nothing at all. Amanda didn't message the profile to find out, and neither did I, and I've never checked the app again since that night, though I know, somewhere in the part of my brain that never fully stopped being afraid, that not knowing is its own kind of unfinished thing sitting quietly at the edge of my life. There's a detail I've never told anyone besides my therapist, one I still can't fully decide what to do with. A couple of weeks after I left him, going back through old photos on my own phone looking for anything I might have missed, I found a picture I'd forgotten I'd taken. A candid shot from our second date, him laughing at something across a table, caught mid-motion with his head tilted slightly to one side. I'd always assumed, without really examining it, that the slight asymmetry in his smile was just an ordinary quirk, the kind everyone has. It was only staring at that photo for a long time, weeks later, that I noticed something that made my stomach drop all over again. A thin, pale scar along his jawline, barely visible unless the light hit it exactly right, in exactly the spot where you'd expect a scar from a car accident's shattered window to leave one. I've never been able to prove what that scar means, and some nights I tell myself it means nothing at all, that plenty of people have small scars along their jaw from 100 unremarkable childhood accidents that have nothing to do with any of this. But other nights, the ones where sleep won't come no matter how long I lie still, I let myself follow the thought all the way to its worst possible ending. That the accident on that icy back road in Kentucky 3 years ago hadn't been quite as one-sided as the story I was told. That somewhere underneath the name Jason Bennett and the name Chris Bennett, there might be an entirely different, far more ordinary explanation than a saint who died and a monster who replaced him, one involving two brothers in the same car on the same night, and a choice made in some unbearable instant about which one of them was going to get to keep being the one who survived it. What stays with me most, more than the fear, more than the strange grief-shaped shame of having loved someone who wasn't real under the name I loved him as, is something Melissa said near the end of that first phone call, almost as an aside, in a voice that had gone very quiet. She said that in the years since she'd left him, she'd started to wonder whether Chris even remembered, underneath whatever had broken in him, that he wasn't actually his brother anymore. Whether some nights, deep enough into the performance, the line between the two of them had genuinely blurred for him, whether the man across the table from each of us had, in some real and terrible sense, stopped, being able to tell the difference between honoring the dead and simply becoming them. I think about that more than I'd like to admit, late at night, in the apartment I now share with a new roommate in a different part of the city, far enough from Jason's old neighborhood that I no longer worry about running into either version of him at a grocery store deli counter. I think about a man standing in a bathroom mirror somewhere, practicing a dead brother's easy laugh, A dead brother's specific way of holding a fork. A dead brother's exact voice saying my name for the first time at a diner that stayed open late enough to work around both our schedules, and I wonder how much of him is even left in there anymore, underneath all that borrowed grief, or whether that's precisely the question he spent 2 years, and however many women trying not to have to answer. 2 weeks ago, Amanda came home and mentioned, almost in passing, that Melissa had reached out to her again. Not about Chris this time, but just checking in, the way you do with someone you've been through something with, even something you never wanted to share with anyone. She'd heard, secondhand, through someone who still lived near the family in Kentucky, that Chris had moved again, out of state this time, and that his mother, Linda, had stopped answering calls from anyone who used to know either of her sons. I don't know what that means. I've stopped expecting to ever fully know what any of it means. And some nights that not knowing sits on my chest like a physical weight, and other nights I manage to set it down long enough to actually sleep. What I do know is that somewhere out there, a man is very likely sitting across a table from another woman right now, in another city, wearing a dead man's easy laugh like a coat that's never quite fit him right, telling her some careful, practiced version of a loss that's true enough to break her heart and false enough, underneath it, to break something else entirely. I hope, if she's reading something like this one day, she gets out faster than I did. I hope she notices the small wrong thing. The too warm recognition at a grocery store, the text from a mother that doesn't fully make sense, the way his face changes for half a second before he catches himself. And that she trusts it enough to look closer before the orbit of her own happiness pulls it back into something she can talk herself out of one more time. I went back to therapy a few months after all of it, something I'd resisted at first, telling myself I was fine, that I'd only known him 7 weeks, that plenty of people went through worse without needing to sit in someone's office once a week talking about it. My therapist, a calm, unhurried woman named Diane Foster. No relation, she assured me, laughing gently, to anyone named Foster I'd ever have reason to worry about, told me something in our 3rd or 4th session that I still turn over sometimes on the nights the not knowing gets loud. She said that what made this particular kind of betrayal so disorienting wasn't just that he'd lied about his name. People lie about plenty of things on those apps. Their height, their job, whether they're actually divorced. What made it different, she said, was that everything else about him had felt so real. The way he listened. The way he showed up for me on the worst night of a bad week without being asked twice. Whatever else Chris Bennett was, however many women had come before me, and however many might come after, the specific attention he'd paid me for those 7 weeks hadn't been an act in the ordinary sense of the word, not entirely. It had been real feeling borrowed and pointed in a stranger's direction, wearing a dead man's name because Chris no longer entirely trusted his own to deserve it. I don't know if that makes it better or infinitely worse. I've asked myself that question more times than I can count. Usually somewhere around 2 in the morning, lying awake in my new apartment with my new roommate asleep down the hall, listening to the specific, ordinary sounds of a building I've made sure, this time, that no one outside a small circle of people I trust completely actually knows the address of. Amanda still checks the app sometimes, more out of a kind of grim vigilance than curiosity, scrolling past profiles on nights she can't sleep, telling me if anything ever looks close enough to worry about. So far, since that one unsettling profile, 4 months after everything fell apart, there's been nothing else. No slightly different jawline, no careful, practiced bio about a brother he doesn't like to talk about yet. I want to believe that means it's over. That Chris Bennett has finally either gotten the help that grief counselor spent 2 years trying to get him to accept, or has simply run out of women willing to fall for the particular, well-worn shape of his performance. But I've learned, the hard way, not to trust the quiet too easily, not to mistake an absence of evidence for an absence of danger. And so instead of relief, what I mostly feel these days is something closer to a permanent, low-grade readiness, the kind you carry the way you'd carry a house key in your pocket. Not thinking about it constantly, but always, somewhere in the back of your mind, aware of exactly where it is. Story number 4. I want to write this all down while I can still keep the timeline straight, because looking back on it now, it's hard to tell which parts happened in what order. It all sort of blurs together into one long, wet, cold stretch of autumn that I'd give almost anything to forget. but I think it's important that I don't forget it. So here it is, from the beginning, as close to exactly how it happened as I can manage. I was 26 at the time, renting a small single-story house at the edge of a town in upstate New York, one of those places where the houses get farther apart the further out you go, until eventually it's just trees and the occasional mailbox leaning sideways at the end of a gravel driveway. Mine was the last house before the road turned to dirt. I worked from home most days, doing freelance graphic design, and I liked the quiet. I liked that I could go a whole day without seeing another person if I didn't feel like it. I know now how naive that sounds. It started, as far as I can tell, in the middle of September. Nothing dramatic, just a feeling. I'd be sitting at my desk, which faced the window that looked out over the driveway and the tree line beyond it, and every so often I'd get this itch at the back of my neck, like someone was watching me work. I'd glance up, and there'd be nothing there. Just the trees, swaying a little in whatever wind was moving through that day. I chalked it up to being alone too much. I'd read somewhere that isolation does strange things to your nervous system, makes you jumpy, makes you see shapes and shadows that aren't really there, so I didn't think much of it. Then, on the 22nd, I found the first cigarette butt. It was sitting right at the end of my driveway, where the gravel met the tree line, half crushed into the dirt like someone had stood there long enough to finish it and then ground it out with their heel. I didn't smoke. Neither did anyone I knew who'd have a reason to be standing at the end of my driveway. I picked it up, turned it over in my fingers, and told myself it had probably blown in from the road, or that some delivery driver had stopped there to have a smoke before pulling up to the house. It was a reasonable explanation. I threw it away and didn't think about it again for almost a week. Then I found another one. Same spot, more or less. And a third a few days after that, except this one was closer to the house, maybe 15 feet from my front porch, sitting in the flower bed my landlord had planted years before I moved in and that I'd never bothered to maintain. That was when the itch at the back of my neck stopped feeling like nothing. I started paying more attention after that. I'd catch myself checking the driveway every time I got up to make coffee, glancing out at the tree line more than I probably needed to. I told my sister about it over the phone, mostly as a joke, something to fill the silence while we talked about nothing in particular. She laughed and said I'd been watching too many true crime shows, and honestly, at the time, I agreed with her. It felt silly to say out loud. A few cigarette butts. That was it. That was the whole story. But then came the footprints. It had rained hard the night before, the kind of rain that turns your yard into a swamp for a day or two afterward, and when I stepped outside the next morning to grab the mail, I saw them cutting straight across the wet grass toward my bedroom window. Not toward the door, toward the window. Boot prints, immense size by the look of them, big and deep in the soft mud, leading from the tree line up to the side of the house, stopping directly beneath the window, and then leading back the way they came. I stood there for a long time, just looking at them, feeling something cold settle into my stomach that didn't go away for the rest of the day. I called my landlord first, mostly because he was the only number I had that felt relevant, and he told me it was probably kids messing around, that it happened sometimes out where I lived, being so close to the woods and all. He offered to come put in a motion sensor light by the driveway, which I appreciated, but it didn't make me feel much better. I also called the police, a non-emergency line, and a deputy came out a couple hours later to take a look. He walked the yard with me, took some photos of the prints on his phone, and told me pretty much the same thing my landlord had. Kids. Bored kids, probably drunk, probably harmless. He said if it happened again to give them a call and they'd step up patrols on my road for a while. I wanted to believe him. I really did. It would have been so much easier to believe him. A couple of days after the deputy left, I mentioned it to my neighbor, an older man named Everett who lived about a quarter mile down the road, on the other side of a stretch of woods that separated our properties. He was the closest thing I had to a neighbor out there, and we'd wave at each other from our cars sometimes, but we didn't know each other well. Still, I found myself standing at the end of his driveway one evening, telling him about the footprints, half hoping he'd tell me he'd seen something too, half hoping he'd tell me it was nothing. He didn't do either. He just got quiet for a second, then told me that a few weeks back, his motion light had been going off most nights around 2 or 3 in the morning, and every time he'd gotten up to check, there was nothing there. He'd assumed it was deer. He said it so evenly, like it wasn't worth worrying about, but something in the way he wouldn't quite meet my eyes when he said it told me he'd thought about it more than he was letting on. I remember walking back to my house that night, watching the tree line the whole way, feeling, for the first time, like the woods between our two properties weren't just empty space. They were a place someone could move through without either of us seeing. For about 2 weeks after that, nothing happened. No cigarette butts, no footprints, nothing but the ordinary quiet of my ordinary life, and I slowly let myself relax back into it. I stopped checking the driveway every time I stood up. I stopped double-checking the locks before bed, or at least I stopped doing it consciously. I think some small animal part of my brain kept doing it whether I noticed or not. By early October, I'd almost managed to convince myself the deputy had been right. Then I found the note. It was tucked under my windshield wiper one morning, folded into a small, tight square, like someone had spent real time creasing it just right. No envelope. Just a piece of plain white paper, the kind you'd pull out of any printer, folded so many times it had gone soft at the edges like fabric. I remember standing in my driveway holding it, not wanting to open it, some instinct in me already knowing that whatever was inside was going to change something. I unfolded it anyway. It said, in block letters written with a marker, I see you moss knits. You look, peaceful W, hen you sleep. I read it maybe 6 times before the words actually landed. And then I ran back inside and locked the door, and I stood in my kitchen shaking for what felt like a very long time. I called the police again, and this time they took it more seriously. An actual detective came out instead of a patrol deputy, a woman named Reyes, who was kind but very direct about how these things usually go. She told me that unless the person made a direct threat, there wasn't a lot they could charge someone with, even if we did identify who was doing it. She told me to start documenting everything, dates, times, anything I noticed out of place, any cars I didn't recognize on my road. She also strongly suggested I consider staying somewhere else for a while, at least until they had a better sense of who was doing this and why. I didn't leave. I want to be honest about that, because looking back, it might have been the wrong call. But it was my home, and some stubborn part of me didn't want to be pushed out of it by someone who hadn't even shown their face. I did buy a security camera system, though. 3 cameras, one over the front door, one over the driveway, and one covering the side of the house near my bedroom window, all of them feeding into an app on my phone that would alert me if they picked up motion. For the first week after installing them, nothing. Not even an animal setting them off. I started to think, stupidly, that maybe the cameras alone had scared him off. Maybe he'd seen me putting them up and decided it wasn't worth the risk anymore. Then, on the 9th night after I installed them, my phone buzzed at 2:47 in the morning with a motion alert from the driveway camera. I sat up in bed so fast I got dizzy. I opened the app with my hands shaking so badly I fumbled the phone twice before I finally got the feed to load. And there, standing at the exact spot where I'd found that first cigarette butt weeks earlier, was a man. He wasn't doing anything. That was almost the worst part. He wasn't trying to break in, wasn't moving toward the house at all. He was just standing there, at the end of my driveway, in the dark, looking up at my house. I couldn't make out his face. He had a hood up, and the porch light didn't reach that far. But I could see the shape of him well enough to know he was tall, broad-shouldered, standing with his hands in his pockets like he had nowhere else to be. Like he was just enjoying the view. I called 911 immediately, my voice barely working, and stayed on the line while the dispatcher walked me through what to do. Stay where I was, keep the doors locked, don't go outside. I watched the feed the entire time, watched him stand there for what the timestamp told me was 11 minutes, though it felt like an hour, before he finally turned and walked unhurried back into the tree line, disappearing into the dark like he'd never been there at all. By the time the deputies arrived, he was long gone. They searched the woods behind my house with flashlights for almost an hour and found nothing. No tracks that led anywhere useful, no sign of a car having been parked nearby, nothing. It was like he'd known exactly how long he had before someone could get there. Detective Reyes came by again the next afternoon, and this time she watched the footage with me, slowing it down, zooming in as far as the resolution would allow, trying to pick out any identifying detail. There wasn't much. Dark jacket, dark hood, jeans, work boots, no visible tattoos, no logos, nothing distinctive. She said she'd run it against anyone with a record in the area, but without a clearer image, there wasn't much to go on. He knew where your camera was, she told me, and I could tell she was choosing her words carefully. He's not avoiding it. He's letting you see him. That's a specific kind of behavior. It usually means he wants you scared. It's part of what he's getting out of this. I didn't sleep that night, or really any night after that. Not properly. I started keeping a bat by my bed, which felt useless and a little theatrical even as I did it. But it was something. I stopped drawing the blinds all the way. Some awful logic in my head decided I'd rather see him coming than not see him at all, which in hindsight was probably exactly backward, but fear doesn't always make sense. Over the next 3 weeks, he showed up on camera 4 more times, never doing anything more than standing there, watching, sometimes for a few minutes, once for almost half an hour, just after 4 a.m. on a Tuesday, standing so still under the tree line that if I hadn't known to look, I might have mistaken him for a fence post. He never came close enough to trigger the porch camera. He seemed to understand exactly where the edges of my camera coverage were, which meant one of 2 things. Either he was watching me install them, or he'd found a way to see the footage himself. Both of those thoughts kept me up at night in different ways. The second sighting was the one that unsettled me the most, at least at the time, because of how ordinary it looked. It was a Thursday evening, not even that late, just after 8, and I got the motion alert while I was still awake, sitting on the couch with the television on. I opened the app expecting a raccoon or a stray cat setting off the sensor, the way it had a handful of times before. Instead, there he was, standing in almost the exact same spot as the first time, except this time he wasn't just looking at the house. He was looking at the living room window, at the exact window I was sitting 15 feet behind, the blue light of the television no doubt washing across my face for anyone watching from that distance. I don't know how long he'd already been standing there before the alert reached my phone. I turned off every light in the house and sat in the dark for almost 2 hours before I worked up the nerve to check the feed again. He was gone by then, but I never found out exactly when he'd left. The third and fourth sightings blurred together somewhat in my memory, both of them shorter. Both of them in the very early hours of the morning, both of them ending the same way. Him simply turning and walking back into the trees, unhurried, like a man leaving a movie he'd already seen before and knew how it ended. What stayed with me longer than either of those, though, was a night in between them when I got no alert at all, but woke up anyway at some hour I couldn't identify, certain, with a certainty that had no evidence behind it, that someone was standing just outside my bedroom window. I lay there for what felt like forever, too afraid to move, too afraid to check my phone, before I finally worked up the courage to look. The camera showed nothing. No alert had ever come through. I've never been able to decide if that was worse than the nights he actually showed up, or if my mind had simply started manufacturing him on its own by that point, which is its own kind of frightening. I started noticing other things, too. Small details that on their own would have meant nothing, but stacked together made my skin crawl. My mail would occasionally be slightly out of order in the box, like it had been shuffled through and put back. A pack of gum I always kept in my car's cup holder went missing, then reappeared 2 days later in the exact same spot, unopened, like it had just been borrowed and returned. My cat, who'd never once been an outdoor cat, started scratching frantically at the back door some nights, hackles up, growling at something in the yard that I couldn't see no matter how hard I looked. I told my sister everything by that point. No more jokes, no more laughing it off. She wanted me to come stay with her in the city, and honestly, some nights I almost did. But every time I packed a bag, some part of me talked myself out of it. I told myself I was being paranoid, that leaving meant he'd won something, that I needed to hold on to some sense of control over my own life. I know now that was fear talking as much as anything else. The exhausting, grinding kind of fear that makes you want to just get it over with rather than keep living inside it. I did leave once, actually for 3 nights in the middle of October, after the half-hour sighting on that Tuesday morning had left me too rattled to stay another night alone. I drove 2 hours to my sister's apartment in the city without telling anyone but her exactly where I was going, not even Detective Reyes, mostly because I wanted, just for a few days, to feel like nobody in the world knew where to find me. Those 3 nights were the first real sleep I'd gotten in weeks. I remember sitting on my sister's fire escape on the second night, looking out over a street full of noise and light and strangers, and feeling something close to safe for the first time in over a month, simply because there were so many people around that I couldn't imagine anyone singling me out of the crowd. When I got back to the house on the fourth day, feeling steadier than I had in a while, I found a takeout menu wedged into my front door, the kind restaurants leave hanging on doorknobs up and down a street. Ordinary enough on its own, except I didn't recognize the restaurant, and when I turned it over, there was a short line written on the back in the same block lettering as before. It said, "Welcome, O home. Didu have fun visiting your sister?" I stood on my own porch for a long time after reading that, the menu shaking in my hand, doing the math in my head, trying to figure out how he could possibly have known where I'd gone when I hadn't told a single soul besides her. I never got a satisfying answer to that. Later, after his arrest, it came out that he'd followed my car at a distance more than once, hanging far enough back on the highway that I'd never noticed him in 3 hours of driving, which is its own kind of quietly horrifying thing to learn about a stretch of road you'd always considered unremarkable. After that, I stopped leaving at all, which in hindsight might have been exactly the wrong instinct, but it felt at the time like the only thing that made sense. If he could find me 2 hours away in a city of 8 million people, then staying inside my own locked house, with cameras and deadbolts and a police non-emergency number saved as a favorite in my phone, felt like the safer option, even if some rational part of me knew that wasn't really true. The turning point, the thing that changed everything, happened on the night of October the 30th, the night before Halloween. I'd had a long day. A client call that ran late into the evening, and by the time I finally shut my laptop, it was already past 11. I made myself a cup of tea, checked that all 3 locks on the front door were engaged. I'd had 2 extra deadbolts installed by that point, and went to bed with the bat propped against my nightstand, same as every night for the past month. I woke up sometime around 3 a.m. to the sound of my back door. Not the front door, the back one, off the kitchen. Very softly, very deliberately, being tried. Not banged on, not kicked. Just the handle, turning slowly, testing whether it would give. I lay there frozen, listening, my whole body gone rigid and cold. The handle turned again, slower this time, like whoever was on the other side was being careful not to make noise. And then it stopped. I don't know how long I lay there after that, not moving, barely breathing, straining to hear any other sound over the roar of my own pulse in my ears. My cat was awake beside me, sitting bolt upright at the foot of the bed, ears pinned flat, staring toward the kitchen with an intensity that made the hair on my own arms rise. She didn't make a sound, which somehow frightened me more than if she'd yowled or bolted. She just watched the doorway, perfectly still, and I watched her watching it, both of us waiting for something neither of us could see yet. Eventually, I made myself reach for my phone, and I opened the camera app with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The driveway camera showed nothing. The front door camera showed nothing. But the side camera, the one covering the area near my bedroom window, was showing a black screen. Not off, not disconnected, just black, like something was covering the lens. That was when I heard it. A soft, patient tapping on my bedroom window. 3 taps. A pause. 3 more. I don't remember deciding to call 911. I just remember that at some point my phone was against my ear and I was whispering to the dispatcher that someone was outside my window, that they were trying my doors, that I needed help now. Please, now. She told me to stay on the line, to get somewhere safe inside the house if I could, away from windows and doors, and to keep as quiet as possible. I crept out of my bedroom, staying low, and made my way toward the small bathroom in the center of the house, the only room without an exterior wall. I locked myself inside, sat on the floor between the toilet and the tub, and listened. The tapping stopped for a while. Then I heard footsteps. Actual footsteps now, no longer trying to be quiet, moving around the side of the house toward the front. And then, very clearly, very close, I heard my front door handle rattle hard, once, twice, and then a heavy, deliberate knock. Not urgent. Not frantic. Just 3 slow, even knocks, like someone politely announcing themselves at a friend's house. I didn't answer. I stayed exactly where I was, phone pressed to my ear, The dispatcher's voice, a thin, steady thread keeping me tethered to something outside my own panic. She told me officers were 4 minutes out. I don't think I've ever measured time the way I measured those 4 minutes, each second stretching out long and thin and unbearable. The knocking didn't come again, but I heard something else. A voice, low, right up against the door, close enough that I understood every word even through the walls between us. "I just want to talk to you," it said. A man's voice, calm, almost gentle, the kind of tone you'd use to soothe a spooked animal. "You don't have to be scared. I've been taking care of you. You don't even know it, but I have." I don't know how to describe what that did to me, hearing that. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something worse, something that made my skin feel like it didn't belong to me. Because it meant this wasn't random. It meant, in his mind at least, there was a relationship here. Some story he'd built where he was something to me, where all of this, the notes, the standing in my yard, the camera he'd somehow figured out how to blind, made sense as an act of devotion instead of what it actually was. The knocking started again, harder this time, and I heard the handle rattling with real force now, the deadbolts holding, but the whole door shuddering in its frame. I stayed frozen on that bathroom floor, gripping my phone so tightly my fingers ached, and I prayed in a way I hadn't prayed since I was a child, just repeating, "Please, please, please," under my breath like it was the only word I had left. And then, distantly, I heard sirens. The rattling stopped instantly. I heard fast footsteps moving away from the door, around the side of the house, and then nothing but the sound of the sirens growing louder, closer, until finally there were flashing lights washing red and blue across the bathroom door frame through the gap under it, and a voice calling out that it was the police, that I could come out, that I was safe. I don't think safe was quite the right word, not that night, maybe not for a long time after. But I did come out. I let them in. I told them everything, the whole timeline, everything I documented over the past 2 months, everything that had led to that door shaking in its frame at 3 a.m. 4 officers searched the property and the tree line for over an hour, and this time they found something. A small camping chair, folded up and hidden behind a fallen log about 60 yards into the woods, positioned with a clear line of sight to my bedroom window. Beside it, a pair of binoculars. Beside those, a small notebook. I wasn't allowed to read it myself. It went into evidence. But Detective Reyes told me some of what was in it, weeks later, once the case had moved further along. It was full of dates and times. My schedule mapped out in obsessive detail. When I woke up, when I made coffee, when I sat down at my desk, when I went to bed. It went back much further than September. The earliest entry was dated in June. He'd been watching me for 4 months before I ever found that first cigarette butt. They caught him 3 days later, on November the 2nd, after a tip came in from a gas station clerk about 40 minutes from my house, who recognized the sketch the detective had put together from what little the cameras had captured combined with witness accounts. His name doesn't matter here, and honestly, I've made a conscious effort not to say it out loud since the trial ended, because some small, stubborn part of me refuses to give him anything else, even that. What matters is that he wasn't a stranger in the way I'd assumed. He'd worked, briefly, for the landscaping company that maintained the lawns on my road 2 summers earlier, before I'd even moved in. He'd seen the house sit empty, watched me move in that spring, and for reasons that came out slowly and horribly over the course of the investigation, had fixated on me almost immediately. The trial took the better part of a year. I moved out of that house within a week of his arrest, staying with my sister in the city until I could find somewhere new, somewhere with neighbors close enough to hear if I screamed, somewhere with streetlights that reached every corner of the yard. I still have the security cameras, 3 of them now in my new place, and I still check the app more often than I'd like to admit, even years later, even with him locked up 2 states away. Detective Reyes stayed in touch with me through most of the process, more than I think she probably had to, and I've always been grateful for that. She was the one who eventually explained, as gently as she could, how he'd managed to blind that side camera the night he came to the door. A can of spray paint from a hardware store 40 minutes away, purchased with cash, found later in the pocket of the jacket he'd been wearing when they arrested him, along with a receipt he apparently hadn't thought to throw away. It should have felt like a small, stupid detail, The kind of mistake that catches careless criminals in every television procedural, but hearing it just made the whole thing feel smaller and more human somehow, which was almost worse. I'd built him up, in the months since, into something closer to a force than a person. Patient, careful, always one step ahead. Learning that he'd left a receipt in his pocket didn't make me feel safer. It just made me angry that something so ordinary, so careless, had been allowed to terrify me for as long as it had. The notebook they found in the woods turned out to be only the first of several. When they searched the apartment, he'd been renting under a name I never actually heard until the arraignment. They found 2 more just like it, along with printed photographs, taken from a distance, through the same trees where he'd set up that folding chair. Of me getting the mail, of me sitting on my porch with a book some Sunday afternoon I didn't even remember, of me standing in my kitchen window, doing something as unremarkable as washing dishes. Detective Reyes didn't show me all of them. She didn't need to. Knowing they existed was enough to keep me up some nights for a long time afterward, wondering how many ordinary, forgettable moments of my life had been cataloged somewhere by a man I'd never spoken a single word to before that night at my front door. At the sentencing, I gave a statement, which I hadn't been sure I'd be able to get through without falling apart, but somehow I did. I talked about the itch at the back of my neck that I'd talked myself out of for weeks. I talked about the cat scratching at the door at things I couldn't see. I talked about the 4 minutes I spent on a bathroom floor, listening to sirens get closer, and how I still measure time against those 4 minutes sometimes, even now when I'm waiting for something good, for a doctor's office to call me back, for a plane to land, for a friend to text that they made it home safe. Everything gets measured against that now, whether I want it to or not. I think about that voice through the door sometimes, the calm, almost tender way he said he'd been taking care of me. I think about how long someone can watch another person's life from the tree line, mapping out every small, mundane detail of their existence, and build from it a story where they belong there, where all of it makes sense. I don't have a neat way to end this. There wasn't a lesson learned, not really. Nothing I can point to and say I'd do differently, because I don't know that I would have. I locked my doors. I called the police the moment something felt wrong. I did everything you're supposed to do. And it still took 4 months of someone living at the edge of my life before I even knew he was there, and another 2 before it nearly cost me something I can't get back. I've talked to a therapist about all of it since, more sessions than I can easily count at this point, and she's told me more than once that the hardest part of recovering from something like this isn't the fear itself. It's learning to trust your own read of a normal, quiet evening again. For a long time after I moved, every unfamiliar car on my new street felt like a threat. Every knock at the door that I wasn't expecting sent my pulse climbing before I'd even reached the peephole. It's gotten better. It really has. But better isn't the same as gone, and I don't think I'll ever fully get back the version of myself that used to sit at a window with the blinds open, working, without a single thought for what might be looking back. Some nights I think about Everett, my old neighbor, and that motion light going off for weeks before I ever found the first cigarette butt, both of us separately noticing something was wrong and neither of us saying anything until it was almost too late. I think about how many quiet signs like that get explained away every single day by people who, like me, would rather believe in deer than in the alternative. I don't blame myself for that anymore. Not really. Not most days. But I understand now why the instinct exists and why it's so dangerous. Because believing the worst about a shadow in your yard means accepting that the world isn't as safe as you need it to be in order to sleep at night, and almost nobody wants to accept that unless they're forced to. What I can tell you is this: if you ever get that itch at the back of your neck, that feeling of being watched when you're alone in a place that should be safe, don't talk yourself out of it. Don't wait for the second sign or the third. I waited for the cigarette butts and the footprints and the note under my windshield wiper, telling myself each time that it was probably nothing, that I was probably imagining it, that surely no one would actually do something like this to a stranger they'd never even spoken to. He was never a stranger to me. Not really. Not in his own mind. He'd built 4 months of a relationship in his head before I ever knew his face, standing quietly at the edge of my yard, taking notes on my life like it was something he was owed. I've thought a lot, in the years since, about that folding camping chair they found behind the fallen log, the ordinariness of it. It wasn't some elaborate hunting blind or anything out of a movie. It was the kind of chair you'd take to a kid's soccer game, foldable, a cheap mesh cup holder built into the arm. I think about him carrying that chair through the woods in the dark, setting it up with the same unremarkable care someone might use getting ready to watch a sunset, and then sitting there for hours at a time, night after night, watching my life happen through a lit window like it was the only entertainment he needed. There's something about that image, the mundane comfort of it, folded chair and binoculars and a spiral notebook, that has stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that whole ordeal. Monsters are supposed to be dramatic. His entire arsenal fit in a backpack from a sporting goods store. I still don't sleep with the blinds fully closed. I don't think I ever will again. Some nights, even now, in a house with neighbors on both sides and motion lights that flood the whole yard the second a rabbit so much as twitches near the property line, I catch myself glancing toward the window before I fall asleep, just checking. Just making sure there's nothing standing there in the dark, patiently waiting for me to notice. There never is, but I still check. I think I'll always still check.
Thank you for watching, and what do you think about that stories? I hope you enjoy and see you on the next video. Bye.